I'll tell you about Sable Cord because I was there for most of it, and because he never would tell it himself. He'd sit across a supper table and listen to you talk about it, and when you were done, he'd nod once and say something like, "You've got most of the facts right," and that would be the end of it. That's Sable, always was. My name is Dex Pruitt. I run the Kessler Range, south of Faro Canyon, and I've known Sable Cord since we were both young enough to think we knew what hard meant. We were wrong then. We learned later. He learned a little harder than me, losing Marin the way he did. 3 years of that grief sitting on him like a stone on a creek bottom, quiet and heavy, and going nowhere. I watched him work his way through it, the only way Sable knew how, by working. By mapping every draw and drainage in that canyon country, until he knew it the way most men know their own kitchen. By building fences and keeping records, and not talking to anybody about anything that mattered. I'm not saying the man was broken. He wasn't. He was just very quiet about certain things, and those things happen to be the ones that count. So when I tell you that Adeline Farr rode into his life on a broken wagon axle and a flooded road and changed the whole shape of it, I want you to understand what that cost her, and what it cost him, and why the ending is the only ending there could have been. It started in October. She'd hired an escort wagon out of Millbrook, a freighter named Cal Dunn, who had a reliable reputation in dry weather and an unreliable one in wet, and she was headed to the settlement at Creston Notch, where the apothecary post had been promised to her in a letter from the Territorial Health Board. Adeline Farr was a trained herbalist and an apothecary's apprentice out of Ohio, and she'd spent 4 years in the Western Territories working alongside a physician in Laramie before the doctor retired and the practice closed, and she found herself with a trade, a good kit of instruments, and a need to find somewhere that needed her. Creston Notch needed her. The letter said so. She packed her trunk and her crates of supplies and she hired Cal Dunn's wagon, and she set out in the 3rd week of October, which was the first mistake, not hers, but the calendar's, and the weather's. Faro Canyon in late October can be passable, or it can be a trap, depending on what comes down from the high country. That year, what came down was 3 days of hard rain, followed by a night of cold that iced the ruts solid, and then another day of rain that broke the ice into slick plates and turned the canyon floor into a river of mud and moving stone. Cal Dunn, to his credit, tried, but the left front wheel of the wagon dropped into a submerged rut, and the axle snapped clean, and the whole rig canted sideways into 2 feet of running water. Cal got the mules free, and the water was rising, and there was a ranch a quarter-mile back up the canyon wall, on a shelf of ground that stayed dry, and he left her there with her trunk and her crates, while he rode one of the mules to Millbrook for help. He did not come back. What he sent back, after 3 weeks, was a letter of apology and a partial refund of her freight fee, which tells you what you need to know about Cal Dunn. That was the 2nd week of October. I know this because Sable told me about it 3 days later when I rode up to check on him after the storm. I came up the canyon road. It was still churned to gruel but passable on horseback, and I found him in the barn working a new shoe onto his mare, and he told me in the same flat voice he used to report on fence conditions that he had a woman staying in the house. I set down what I was holding and looked at him. "A woman," I said. "An apothecary," he said, "from Ohio. Her wagon broke in the flood. Cal Dunn left her here." "Where's Cal?" "Millbrook, presumably, or he drowned. Either way, the road's been closed 4 days. She's not going anywhere until it opens." I asked if he needed anything. He said he didn't. I asked how she was settling in. He looked at me the way he looked at you, when he thought you were wasting his time, which was a look that had an edge on it like a good knife. "She's fine," he said. "She asked to look at my record books." "Your land records?" "My botanical survey records. I kept notes on the canyon plants when I was mapping the drainages. She said she hadn't seen half of what I described." I let that sit for a moment. I said, "What did you tell her?" He turned back to the mare's hoof. "I told her she could look at them." Now, I want to be honest with you. I did not think much of this at the time. Sable was a private man who had not had a woman in his house since Marin died, and I thought it was good for him, the presence of another person, the disruption of his routine. I did not think it was going to be anything more than a few awkward days until the road opened, and she went on her way. The road did not open. What happened was a second storm blew in from the northwest on the 4th day, harder than the first, and dumped another inch of rain on top of the saturated canyon floor, and the road that had been borderline passable became a river in its own right. After that, the temperature dropped, and the mud froze solid, but now with ruts 18 inches deep, and a wagon couldn't cross it without breaking something else. The road would not be truly passable, Sable figured, until the freeze broke and then dried, which was 6 weeks away at minimum, and more likely 8. Adeline Farr was going to be at Faro Canyon through the end of November. I found this out when Sable rode down to my place the following Sunday, which was unusual, because Sable did not come to me. I went to him, and he stood in my kitchen and told me what the road situation was, and then he said something that I could tell he'd been working up to for the whole ride down. He said, "I need to know what to do about a propriety problem." I poured him coffee and sat down. He stayed standing. "Marsh came by yesterday," he said. Marsh was our circuit justice of the peace, an officious little man named Aldous Marsh, who rode a circuit between 4 settlements and had strong opinions about the moral character of the frontier. He said he'd heard about the woman at my place, and he wanted to make clear that if she was there through November without a formal arrangement, he'd have to make a note of it in his report, and the territory sends those reports to the health board. I understood immediately. The health board that had offered Adeline Farr her post at Creston Notch. One note from Aldous Marsh, and the post might evaporate. She'd come this far, left Ohio, spent years in the territories, and she was one disapproving circuit judge away from losing the thing she'd come for. "What does she say?" I asked. "She says she can leave on horseback before the report goes in. She says she doesn't need the post badly enough to do something she doesn't want to do." "But," I said, because there was clearly a but. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee cup. "I told her the canyon gets snow by the 2nd week of November, and the high trail to Millbrook closes after that. She'd be riding 40 miles in freezing weather with no shelter, and it's possible she wouldn't make it." I looked at him. "So, you're not going to let her leave?" I said. "I'm not going to let her do something foolish on my account," he said, which was a different thing, but came to the same place. "So I need to know if there's a practical solution here." What he was asking, and he could not quite bring himself to say it directly, was whether there was a way to give her the protection of a formal arrangement without it being the kind of thing that damaged either of them. A practical matter. A legal fact that would satisfy Aldous Marsh and preserve her post and keep her safe through the winter and not cost her anything she didn't agree to give. He was asking me if I thought she'd agree to marry him, in name, for the winter. I said, "Have you talked to her about it?" "No," he said. "I don't know how to talk to her about it. Sable. She's from Ohio, Dex. She's educated, and she's particular, and she has her own opinions about everything in my record books, and half my canyon plants, and she is not." He stopped. He set down the cup. "I don't want to insult her." I thought about that for a while. Then I said, "Tell her exactly what you told me. The road situation, Marsh's report, the health board. Give her all the facts, and let her decide. She sounds like the kind of woman who can make a decision when she has the information." He considered this for what felt like a long time. "All right," he said. He rode back up the canyon, and I didn't hear from him for 3 days. When he came back, he said, she agreed. She said she wanted it in writing, that the arrangement was temporary, and that she retained full right to dissolve it when the road opened in spring. I said, "Did you put it in writing?" "I wrote it out myself, and she signed it, and I signed it." "And then what?" He picked up his coffee, and then Marsh came by, and we told him. He performed the ceremony. He seemed disappointed that he wasn't going to get to put anything in his report. I couldn't help it. I laughed. Sable looked at me without expression. "I'm glad someone finds it funny," he said. I said, "What are you going to do now?" He said, "The same thing I was doing before. Run the cattle, fix the fence on the north wall, get through winter." And that, from Sable's point of view, was the plan. Practical, orderly, no surprises. He had a signed document. She had her propriety and her post. They would coexist in his house for 4 months, and in the spring the road would open, and she would go to Creston Notch, and that would be the end of it. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that Sable Cord genuinely believed that's what was going to happen. He believed it the way an honest man believes things, fully, without reservation, having thought it through and found it reasonable. He'd signed a document. The terms were clear. He was going to honor them and expect nothing else. He was wrong, but that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is how he found out. I went up to the ranch in the first week of November, riding up the canyon shelf road, which was better than it had been but still half frozen and ugly, and I found them both at the kitchen table. Sable was working through his ledgers. Adeline Farr was at the other end of the same table, with what looked like a hand-drawn map spread in front of her, and she was comparing it to a small notebook she had open beside it. She was cross-referencing his botanical survey against some notation system of her own, making small, careful marks in her notebook wherever the two aligned. She looked up when I came in and introduced herself with a directness that I liked right away. She had brown eyes and a composed quality about her. Not cool, not unfriendly, just organized. She was the kind of person who took stock of a room quickly and filed it away. She offered me coffee before Sable did, which made him look up from his ledger briefly and then back down without comment. I sat with them for an hour. What struck me was how they moved around each other in that kitchen, not uncomfortably, more like two people who had been in the same small space long enough to establish a kind of traffic pattern. She got up to check something on the stove. He reached past her for the lamp without looking. She moved the lamp, and he put his hand down in the right place. They weren't aware of it. That's what struck me. When I got up to go, Adeline walked me to the door and said quietly, "He works very hard." I said, "He always has." She said, "I mean at not showing things. He works hard at that too." I looked at her. She looked back at me with those composed eyes, steady and precise. Then she went back inside. On the way out, I said to Sable quietly, "She seems to be settling in all right." He said, "She reorganized the kitchen." I waited. He said, "It's more efficient now." He said it the way he would say that a fence had been reset properly. A fact, an improvement. Nothing wrong with it. I rode home smiling, and I didn't tell him why. Through November, I heard about things secondhand, from Sable, when he rode down for supplies, and occasionally from Adeline herself, when she sent me a note, asking a practical question about the canyon country. She had good questions. She wanted to know about the winterberry growth in the south drainage, and whether the black sage on the eastern shelf was the same variety she'd cataloged in Laramie, and whether the spring that came out of the canyon wall near Sable's north fence was reliable in winter. I answered what I could. A couple of the botanical questions I had to pass to Sable, who had the survey records, and he answered them, and sent the answers back with mine. At some point, she started sending her botanical questions directly to him, and cutting out the middleman, which I considered progress. From what I pieced together later, November was the month when they stopped being strangers and became something else. Not yet what they would be, but not what they'd started as. She'd go through the survey journals in the evening and ask him questions, and he'd answer them. And what she discovered was that he'd kept records that were genuinely remarkable. Not just botanical notation, but ecological observation, the way the plants interacted with the drainage patterns, which species grew in the shadow of which others, what the soil told you about what was coming. She'd been trained to observe carefully, and so had he, and when you put two people like that in a room together, with a shared subject, they can go for hours without noticing the time. He showed her, one evening in the middle of the month, a section of the survey from the spring at the canyon wall, the one she'd asked me about, the reliable winter spring. He'd sketched the surrounding soil profile and the plant community growing in the constant moisture of the seep, and he'd noted in his careful handwriting the species he recognized and put a question mark beside the ones he didn't. She went through the question marks one by one and identified 4 of the 5 from her medical references and her Laramie notes, and the 5th she thought she might be able to identify if the plant was still accessible in winter. He said it was. It stayed green through the cold because of the spring's warmth. She asked if they could go look at it. He said yes, they could go in the morning if the weather held. The weather held, and they rode out to the spring in the clear, cold morning, and she knelt down in the frozen mud and looked at the plant for a long time and made notes, and took a small cutting to press. He held the horse and watched her work. On the way back, she told him it was the same species as one she'd seen growing in a limestone seep in Laramie, which the physician there had used for treating persistent coughs. and she thought the canyon version might be more potent because of the mineral content of the water. He told her about the mineral content of the canyon springs. He'd noted it because it affected which cattle he watered where. She hadn't known that, and she asked him 3 more questions about water chemistry, and he answered them from 8 years of watching the canyon, and she wrote down everything he said. He told me once that he'd started to look forward to the evenings. He said it in the same neutral way he'd have said that the north fence was holding. A factual report, no emphasis. And I thought, you have no idea what you just told me. But I didn't say that to him. Sable came to things in his own time, and you learned not to rush him. The Thanksgiving storm was the first real test. I know about this because Sable told me afterward, when he came down for flour in the first week of December. He told it the way he told things, in order, without embellishment, and I've filled in some of what he left out from what Adeline told me later, in spring, when she was willing to talk about it. What happened was this. The storm came in faster than the signs suggested, which is the canyon's way of doing things, and by mid-afternoon it was snowing hard, and the wind was picking up, and Sable went out to check the herd, and found that 18 head had pushed through a weak section of fence on the north wall, and were out on the shelf above the canyon road. The shelf was navigable in dry weather, but in ice and blowing snow, it was dangerous for cattle, because there was a drop on the north side that a panicked animal could go over. He needed them moved back through the fence, and the break repaired before dark, and the light was already going. He came back to the house for his tools and his heavy coat, and Adeline met him at the door and said, "What do you need?" He told her what had happened. He said afterward that he'd meant it as information, not as a request for help. He was used to working alone, and he wasn't going to put her in that weather. But she was already pulling on her coat when he finished explaining, and she said, "I can ride. Tell me where to come in from to push them back through." He said, "It's icy, and the wind is." "I know what the wind is," she said. "I've been listening to it for 2 hours. Tell me where to come in from." He told her. She went and got the horse from the barn. She'd learned to saddle it herself in the first week, he said, because she did not like asking for help with things she could learn to do, and they went out in the storm together. They spent 2 hours in the dark, and the blowing cold moving 18 cattle back through a broken fence and nailing it shut in freezing wind with their fingers going numb. She rode the uphill side, pushing the strays down toward the gap. He said she did it right. He said she read the cattle well, and she didn't panic when one of them turned the wrong way, and he had to shout across the wind to redirect her, and she understood the shout and corrected without making the animal bolt. When they came in, they were both half frozen. She made coffee, and he built up the fire, and they sat on either side of it, wrapped in blankets, while the storm hit the roof, and they slowly thawed out. He said they didn't talk much for a while. There wasn't much to say. They'd done the thing that needed doing, and that was its own completion. The cattle were in, and the fence was shut, and the fire was warm, and the storm was outside where it belonged. But somewhere in the thawing out, after the second cup of coffee, she said, "Your survey of the north wall drainage. You noted a plant in June that you described as silver-leafed with a blue flower and a root that smelled like turpentine. I think it might be a species the Laramie physician called blue needle root. He used a preparation of the root for joint pain. Do you still have the sample you pressed?" He said yes, he had it in the survey journal. She said, "I'd like to look at it when you have time." He said, "I have time now." He went and got the journal, and they sat by the fire and went through it, and she asked him questions about where exactly on the north wall he'd found the plant, and what the soil was like, and whether he'd seen it in other drainages. And he answered, and asked her what the physician's preparation involved, and she explained it. And they talked about the canyon's medicinal flora, for what he told me afterward was close to 3 hours. He said the storm was still going when they finished. He said he hadn't noticed. I asked him if he'd said anything to her about the fence work. He said, "I told her she did good work in the storm." I asked what she said to that. He paused a moment. She said, "I know, but thank you for saying it." I thought about that for a while after he left. There was something in it. Not vanity. Nothing like that. A woman who knew her own worth and didn't need his assessment of it, but was glad he'd offered it anyway. That's a different thing from needing to be told. She already knew. She just appreciated that he'd seen it clearly enough to say so. and a man who'd spent 3 years saying nothing meaningful to anyone, discovering that he had things worth saying. That was the shape of it. In November. December went quiet. I rode up once and stayed for supper and watched them across the table. The traffic pattern I'd noticed in November was more pronounced now. They passed things before the other asked. They had a rhythm to the evening chores that looked like something worked out over time without being discussed. She checked the water on the stove. He banked the fire. She set the lamp on the table. He trimmed the wick without being asked. Small calibrations, the kind that don't happen by accident. She had a small notebook she kept on the windowsill, and she was writing something in it. Not letters, I thought. The pages looked more like notes, lists, observations. When I asked her about it, she said she was documenting the canyon's plant life through the winter, what was dormant and where, what the soil looked like frozen, so that she'd have a baseline comparison when things came up in spring. I said, "You're planning to be here in spring?" She looked up at me with those composed brown eyes. "I mean the spring observations from the survey records that Sable made. I'm making notes against them." "Right," I said. "Of course." But she held my look a half-second too long before she went back to the notebook, and I thought, she knows what I meant, and she's thought about it. Sable was at the stove and he had his back to both of us, and I don't think he heard, or if he heard, he didn't understand what I was watching. He was never quick to see what was right in front of him when it came to that kind of thing. Marin used to say, it was his best quality, that he didn't look for things he wasn't sure were real. He waited until they were plainly there, and then he saw them clearly. She said, it saved them both from a lot of mistakes. That was December. Then came January, and the storm that changed everything. It started on a Sunday, and it didn't stop for 10 days. That's not unusual for the high canyon in January. A blocking pattern settles over the mountains, and the cold and the snow just keep arriving in waves. But 10 days is at the long end of usual, and the drifts built up against the north wall of the house, until they were level with the windowsills, and there was no question of going anywhere or doing anything except keeping the fire going and feeding the cattle from the hay Sable had put up in October. He'd put up plenty. He always put up plenty. He'd been doing this long enough to know that the canyon would eventually try to starve you, and you had to be ready. The cattle were in good shape. The house was tight, and the wood was stacked deep under the lean-to. They were not in any danger. What they were in was 10 days together, with nowhere to go. I'm going to tell you what Sable told me about those 10 days, and I'm going to tell you what Adeline told me later, separately, when she was willing to, and where the two accounts fit together I'll let them, and where they differ, I'll tell you both. The first 3 days of the storm they kept their routines. He had his accounts and his records. She had her observation notebook and her 3 medical references, and the survey journals he'd lent her. The meals were at the same times. The chores went in the same order. The conversation was the same kind they'd been having since November. Practical, shared subject, the plant surveys and the canyon ecology and her work in Laramie. Neither of them remarked on the storm or the confined space, or the fact that there was absolutely nothing either of them could do about any of it. Sable said, "She asked me about Marin on the 3rd day." He hadn't expected it. He said the question came at the end of the evening. They'd been going through the botanical survey again, talking through her notes on the winterberry in the south drainage, and she closed the journal she'd borrowed and set her pen down, and she said, "You don't have to tell me about her, but I'd like to know who she was, if you're willing." He said he sat with that for a while. The fire was burning down, and he didn't build it up yet. He just sat with it. Then he said, "She was from this canyon. Her family homesteaded the East Shelf before I bought the ranch. She knew every inch of it. She died of a fever in the 3rd summer after we married." Adeline said, "I'm sorry." He said, "She would have liked your questions. She was curious about plants too. She kept a kitchen garden that had things in it I couldn't name. I asked her once what half of them were for, and she said, for eating or for healing, and sometimes both, and sometimes just because they were beautiful." Adeline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My mother kept a kitchen garden in Ohio. I used to follow her around it, asking what everything was, and she'd answer every question, no matter how many times I'd already asked." He said, "Is that why you became an apothecary?" She said, "Partly. Partly because someone needs to know what to do when people are hurt, and there's no physician for 40 miles. I watched a man die in Laramie, of something that was treatable, because the physician was 3 days ride out, and nobody else knew what to do. After that, I thought, knowing things has a purpose that goes beyond curiosity. He said he nodded at that. He understood that kind of practicality, the decision to do something because it was needed, not because it was convenient or comfortable. He told her so, and she looked at him with a slight surprise that shifted into something warmer, and she said, "Yes. That's exactly it. Most people want to know what use a thing is before they put work into it. You're the same. I can tell from the survey records. You didn't map the canyon for sport." He said, "No. I mapped it because I didn't know it well enough, and not knowing it felt like a liability." She said, "That's why I asked every question twice in my mother's garden." It was the first time, he told me, that he'd felt understood by another person in 3 years. Not sympathized with, understood. There's a difference. Sympathy says, "You feel something, I'm sorry." Understanding says, "You're built a particular way, and so am I, and I see the shape of it." He sat with it very carefully, like a man who'd found a thing he thought was lost, and wasn't sure yet how to pick it up. The 4th day of the storm, Adeline had a headache that didn't lift through the morning. She didn't say much about it. She was not the kind of person who catalogued her minor discomforts aloud, but Sable noticed. He noticed the way she kept her eyes slightly narrowed at the lamplight, and the way she ate less than usual at the midday meal, and the way she sat very still, when stillness wasn't her natural state. He didn't ask about it. He went to the supply shelf and came back with a preparation she'd made 2 weeks before from the blue needle root. She'd prepared a small quantity experimentally to verify the Laramie physician's notes on its properties, and he set it in front of her and said, "Try some of this. You're the one who made it." She told me later that she was startled, not by the preparation, she knew where it was on the shelf, but by the fact that he'd known to get it, and that he'd paid close enough attention to her work to connect the preparation to what she needed. She hadn't mentioned it, he'd seen it. She took a small amount, and the headache eased by afternoon, and she wrote a careful note about it in her observation book, the root's efficacy, the quantity, the duration of relief. And while she was writing, she told me, she realized she was not thinking about Creston Notch. She tried to, and found that when she put the thought there, it didn't stay. What stayed was the room she was in, and the man on the other side of the fire, and the canyon outside the window buried in 10 days of snow. She wrote in her notebook for a while longer, and then she put it down and looked at the fire, and she thought, "I am not dreading the spring the way I expected to." She hadn't let herself think clearly about that until that afternoon. She'd been careful, the way she was careful with everything, watching, assessing, drawing no conclusions until the evidence warranted it. But the evidence was accumulating, and she was a scientist of sorts, and she knew what to do with accumulated evidence. The 5th and 6th days were the coldest. The temperature inside stayed tolerable, because the fire was good and the walls were thick. Sable had built the house to last, not to look at, but they stayed near the fire and found their tasks close to it. She read from her medical references and made annotations. He worked through a winter accounts ledger he'd been putting off. In the evenings, they talked with the ease of people who'd been at it for months and had gotten past the effort of starting. Conversation came naturally now, took its own direction, went places that neither of them had planned on when the evening began. They talked about what a frontier apothecary's practice actually required, the variety of conditions she'd need to treat, the supply chain problems, the question of whether the canyon's flora could supplement what she couldn't get from Millbrook. He had opinions on the supply chain because he dealt with it himself, and she had questions that were more specific than anyone had thought to ask him before, and the conversation went on past the time they'd usually have banked the fire and gone to bed. He told me he'd looked up once, and the lamp was burning low, and he'd thought, "It's late," and then he'd thought, "I don't mind." On the 6th evening, she told him about the man who'd died in Laramie, the one whose death had confirmed her in her work. She told him the details she hadn't mentioned when she'd first referenced it on the 3rd day. The man was a farmer, 32 years old, with a wife and 3 children, and the injury was something a competent surgeon could have handled without difficulty, but which had gone septic because there was no one to clean and close it properly. She'd done what she could. It hadn't been enough. She said she went home that evening and made a list of every procedure she didn't know how to do, and she spent the next year learning all of them. She was matter-of-fact about it, the way she was matter-of-fact about most things. But her voice when she said the man's name, Fletcher, she said, Aaron Fletcher, had a weight in it that she didn't try to disguise. Sable said, "Did you know him?" She said, "Not well, but his wife came to me the day before and asked if he was going to be all right, and I told her I thought so, and he wasn't." He said, "You told her what you believed." She said, "I told her what I hoped. There's a difference, and I knew the difference, and I said what I hoped because it was easier. I haven't done it since." He said, "No, I don't expect you have." She looked at him. She said, "Most people want to argue about it. They say I was kind, I meant well, anyone would have done the same." He said, "You know whether you were kind or whether you were afraid." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Yes." He said, "The next one was all right because of Aaron Fletcher." She said, "That's what I tell myself." He said, "It's true." She looked at him across the fire. She said, "You're a practical man." He said, "I try to be." She said, "I mean it as a compliment. The world has enough people who are kind about things that have already happened. It has fewer who are useful about what comes next." He nodded. He said, "Same thing that made you list what you didn't know." She said, "Exactly. What those 2 days were, though neither of them said it yet, was a testing of the limits of the arrangement. Not deliberately, not with any agenda, but the way a man tests a new fence line by walking it, not because he doubts it, but because it's what you do when something matters. They were finding out, without asking, how much more than practical their situation had become. On the 7th day of the storm, Sable told her something he hadn't told anyone in 3 years. He said he'd been carrying it since Marin died, this particular thing, and he hadn't said it aloud, partly because there was no one he'd wanted to say it to, and partly because he hadn't known how to begin. He said she'd asked him about Marin on the 3rd day, and it had opened something, and over the next few days he'd found himself circling what was inside that opening, and he'd thought she probably deserved to know it. He said, "I don't think I knew how to be with a person before Marin died. She taught me. She was patient about it. She understood that I was built a certain way, and she didn't try to change the shape. She just gave me a reason to use what I had. And when she died, I thought that knowledge was just over, that it would go with her, and I'd go back to being the man I was before, which wasn't much. And I did, for 3 years. And then you arrived with a broken axle, and started asking questions, and reorganizing my kitchen, and telling me what I'd misidentified in the north drainage, and I—" He stopped. He looked at the fire. He said, "I remembered how to be with a person. I didn't know I still had that." Adeline was very still. She was watching him the way she watched things that mattered, with her full attention, not managed or polite, but real. She said, after a long moment, "I've been so focused on where I was going that I stopped noticing where I was." He said, "Crest and notch?" She said, "My life. I've been moving toward something for 4 years. The post, the practice, the useful work, and I stopped looking at what was beside me on the road." He said, "What's beside you?" She looked at him. She said, "You, this canyon, 3 months of something that has felt more like a life than the last 4 years of working toward one." Sable said he didn't answer right away. He said he understood what she was saying, and he needed to think carefully about whether he had the right to respond to it, because what she was saying changed the shape of what they'd agreed to, and he didn't want to take advantage of an arrangement she'd entered for practical reasons. He didn't want her to feel that the storm, or the confined space, or the months of proximity had narrowed her options in some way she hadn't consented to. He was, in other words, being Sable, precise and deliberate and worried about whether it was fair. He said eventually, "The document we signed gives you the right to dissolve the arrangement when the road opens. I want you to know that I mean that. Whatever happens in this storm, that right doesn't change." She looked at him for a while. Her expression was the one I'd come to know, composed, clear-eyed, giving nothing away until she'd decided what to give. Then she said, "Sable, I'm an apothecary. I make careful assessments with incomplete information, and I draw conclusions, and I act on them. I've been making an assessment of you for 3 months. I have reached a conclusion." He said, "What's the conclusion?" She said, I'm not going to dissolve the arrangement. He said, because of the post at Creston Notch. She said, because I don't want to. I am being as plain as I know how to be. He sat with that for a long moment. Then he said, since when? She said, November. The storm. When you told me I'd done good work with the cattle, and I heard in your voice that you meant it exactly the way you said it. He was quiet. She said, you tell the truth, Sable. It sounds simple, but it's not. Most people tell you what they think you want, or what they think is safe. You tell the truth. I don't take that lightly. He said, I know you don't. She said, so. He nodded. He looked at the fire. Outside, the storm was still running hard against the canyon walls. 10 days of white and cold and wind. And inside, there was the fire and the lamp, and the smell of the coffee she'd made 2 hours ago, and the sound of his own heartbeat in his chest, which he'd stopped paying attention to for 3 years, and had started noticing again in November, and hadn't said a word about to anyone. He said, and she told me this part in spring, quietly, because he couldn't quite, he said, I asked God to let me keep you, every morning of this storm. I want you to know that. She said, I know. I could tell. And that was that, in the way of people who mean what they say, and don't feel the need to say it more than once. The storm ended on the 10th day, and the canyon was buried and white and quiet, and they dug out together, and the world was still there on the other side of it. In February, the post to Creston Notch sent a rider with a letter. Cal Dunn had eventually reached Millbrook and reported the situation, and the health board wanted to know whether Adeline Farr was still intending to take the post in spring. The letter reached the ranch by way of my place, since the direct route was still hazardous, and I was the recognized relay point for the canyon settlements. I brought it up myself on a clear February afternoon. I found her in the room she'd converted to a workroom, a corner of the main house where she'd set up her instruments and her crates and her references, a proper apothecary station that she'd been running informally for the families in the canyon settlements since December, when word had spread that there was a trained herbalist at the Cord Ranch. I handed her the letter and sat down in the chair by the window while she read it. She folded it carefully when she was done. She thought for a moment. Then she took out her pen and her paper, and she wrote the reply right there, without apparent difficulty, the way she did things that she'd already decided. She told them she was married now, and she was staying in Faro Canyon, and if they needed an apothecary for the canyon settlement, which had 12 families and no medical services within 40 miles, she would be available, but she would not be coming to Creston Notch. She handed me the letter to read when she'd finished. I said, "Are you certain?" She said, 4 years certain. She meant it the way Sable meant things. Without decoration, without hedging. It was the fact, and the fact was settled. I folded the letter and said I'd see it sent, and I rode home, thinking about the particular kind of courage it takes to cross towards something you know, rather than away from something you fear. March came, and the road began to open. The freeze broke in the lower canyon first, and crept up. And by the 3rd week of March, you could ride the shelf road in dry conditions, though a wagon would have to wait another few weeks. The canyon was opening up again, the rock walls running with snowmelt, the creek higher than it had been since October, the south drainage showing the first hint of green where the winterberry was budding out below the ice. On a morning in the 3rd week of March, Sable came in from the morning chores and found Adeline at the kitchen table with her observation notebook and a cup of coffee, writing up her winter records. He poured his own coffee, and he sat down across from her, and he said, "The road's passable." She said, "I know. I wrote it yesterday." He said, "You wrote it." She said, "I wanted to know what it felt like." He said, "What did it feel like?" She looked up from the notebook. She said, "Like a road I've already crossed." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. She went back to her writing. He sat with his coffee, and he sat with what he wanted to say, and he was a man who could be very patient with what he wanted to say, because he believed in saying things right, or not saying them. He said, and this is the part that he told me himself, sitting at my kitchen table in April, and his voice had that quiet warmth in it. He said, "I'd like to ask you something, but I want you to know first that the document we signed still stands, and you have every right." She said, "Yes." He said, "I haven't asked yet." She said, You're going to ask if I'll stay, not as an arrangement, but because I want to. And the answer is yes. I've been certain since January. He sat with that for a long moment. Then he said, since January. She said, the 7th day of the storm, when you told me you'd remembered how to be with a person. He said, I told you something I'd never said to anyone. She said, I know, that's why. He nodded. He picked up his coffee. He looked out the window at the canyon walls catching the March light, the snow melting off the red rock in thin silver lines, the south drainage budding green below, the world opening up again after a long winter. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he's known a long time and is glad to have. He said, not as an arrangement. She said, as a life. He said, all right. He said it simply, the way he said all things that mattered. She nodded and went back to her notebook. He went back to his coffee, and that was that. They had Marsh out in April, Aldous Marsh, the same circuit justice who'd started the whole thing with his propriety concerns. And Marsh performed a second ceremony, a real one this time, and I stood with them, and so did a dozen neighbors from the canyon settlements who'd heard there was finally a proper apothecary in Faro Canyon and had been waiting to introduce themselves. It was a good day, cold still, the way April in the canyon always is, but with sun on the canyon walls and the first true green on the south drainage, and the blue needle root coming up early on the north wall. Adeline wore a dark blue dress that was her good one, and she had a sprig of blue needle root flower tucked in her hair. She'd gone and found it the week before, quietly, and pressed one, and put it in her notebook, and worn one on the day. I don't think Sable knew she was going to do that. When he saw it, he stopped still for just a moment, and she looked at him with those composed brown eyes, and a small, precise smile, and he said something to her too quiet for me to catch, and she nodded once. Whatever it was between them. I didn't ask what he said. It wasn't mine to know. What I know is this, that the Faro Canyon apothecary practice opened the following week, in a room Sable added to the east side of the ranch house, fitted out with her crates of supplies and her instruments, and her 3 medical references, and the observation notebook that was full now, front to back, with a winter's worth of the canyon's botanical life. She saw her first official patients within the month, though she'd been seeing them unofficially since December. Word spread through the canyon settlements, and by summer, she was riding the drainage roads regularly, with her kit and her notebook, and a good horse that Sable had picked for her, steady-gaited and sure-footed on the shelf roads, which were the only kind that mattered here. Sable kept his cattle and his fences and his records, and he added a survey of the south drainage that spring, because Adeline had asked 3 careful questions about plants he hadn't yet mapped, and he figured he might as well do it properly. She came with him on the survey days when she could, walking the drainage with her notebook, kneeling down to look at root systems, asking him questions about the soil layers and the water patterns, and him answering, and her making notes, and the canyon being just the way it always was, except that now, someone else knew it the way he did. He said once, in the 2nd year, that he'd been afraid the arrangement would work exactly as written, that she'd stay the winter and leave in spring, and he'd be back where he started, except worse, because he'd know what it felt like to have the house full again. He said he'd spent January being careful not to show her any of it, because the document said she had the right to leave, and he was not going to be the thing that made her feel she couldn't. I said, "You almost didn't tell her." He said, "I told her on day 7. I said, "Why day 7? He was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window at the canyon, where the late afternoon light was doing what it does in summer, going gold and warm on the red rock walls, until the whole canyon glows from the inside. He said, "Because I looked at her sitting by that fire on day 6, and I thought, if she leaves in spring, I will have let the best thing I've ever been offered go by without saying a word, and I'll be the same man I was before, except that I'll know exactly what I lost, and I couldn't live with that." I said, "So you told her?" He said, "I told her the truth. That's all I know how to do." I said, "It was enough." He said, "It was enough." I rode up to the ranch in June, a year to the month from when I'd first heard about the broken wagon axle. I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, and the canyon was full of summer, warm rock and the smell of sage, and the sound of the creek carrying down from the high shelf, the herd quiet on the east range, the south drainage green, and full of things Adeline had identified and catalogued, and in several cases, found uses for that she was still writing up in her observation book. She came out and sat beside me after a while. I asked her how it was. She looked out at the canyon walls, the way the light hit the red rock in the late afternoon, and turned it that color that has no name in any language I know. She said, "It's a good life, Dex." I said, "I know it is." She said, "I almost rode out. That first week, before Sable talked to Marsh, I almost got on a horse and taken my chances with the high trail." I said, "What stopped you?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "He showed me the survey records. The botanical survey. He'd mapped every drainage in this canyon, and he'd noted 100 plants that I'd never seen referenced in any medical text, and some of them I thought might have uses that nobody'd cataloged yet." She paused. I told myself I couldn't leave without knowing what was in those records. I said, "And now?" She looked at the canyon. She said, "Now I know what's in the records. Now I'm staying for a different reason." Sable came out of the barn and walked up to the porch and looked at us. He said, "Supper in half an hour." Adeline said, "I know. I've got it on." He nodded and went inside. I looked at her. She was watching the place where he'd gone in, her expression composed as always, except that her eyes were warm, and her mouth had a softness that wasn't usually there when the world was watching. She caught me looking. She said, "What?" I said, "Nothing. I was just thinking about a signed document." She said, "What document?" I said, "Never mind." She shook her head at me, the way you do at a man who knows too much and won't quite say it, and she went inside to see to the supper. I sat there on the porch in the canyon quiet, and I thought about the flood and the broken axle and Aldous Marsh and a 10-day storm in January, and about all the ordinary accidents that had to line up just right to put two people in a room together, long enough for them to find out who they were. There are stories that turn on great moments. This one turned on a broken axle, and a road that closed, and a practical man's worry about propriety, and a woman who was too clear-eyed to be insulted by honest information. It turned on 10 days of storm, and a botany journal, and a route that smelled like turpentine. It turned on a man who told the truth, because it was all he knew how to do, and a woman who had been paying close enough attention to know that the truth was what it was. I've known Sable Cord since we were young and foolish, and I watched him go through 3 years of quiet grief, and I watched him come out the other side of it in a flooded canyon winter with a woman who asked good questions and reorganized his kitchen and rode out into a November storm without being asked to. Some things you can only find if the road closes and there's nowhere left to go but in.